The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor of the Plaza Hotel's Grand Ballroom at exactly 9:47 p.m. on Saturday, November 8, 1958, 3 seconds after Charles Robert Wagner, 320-year-old nephew of New York City Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr., and heir to one of the city's most powerful political dynasties, pointed at Mayme Johnson across the crowded charity gala and announced, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear, that she was nothing more than a N*****'s toy dressed up in white people's jewelry, creating a moment of shocked silence that lasted approximately 7 seconds before Bumpy Johnson's wife calmly set down her own glass, stood with the dignified composure that had characterized her entire life, navigating Harlem's complex social landscape, and walked directly toward the young white man whose family connections to City Hall had apparently convinced him that he could publicly humiliate prominent black woman without facing consequences that would destroy everything his privileged life had been built upon. Mayme Johnson was 44 years old in November 1958, had been married to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for 10 years since their October 1948 wedding, and had spent that decade establishing herself as one of Harlem's most respected and admired women through combination of innate fierce intelligence, unwavering dignity, and strategic understanding of how to navigate between her husband's criminal empire and the legitimate social circles where her charm, education, and refinement earned acceptance from people who might otherwise have refused association with gangster's wife. She wore that evening a cream-colored Givenchy gown that Bumpy had purchased during their recent Paris trip, diamond necklace and matching earrings worth approximately $47,000, and carried herself with poise that made her indistinguishable from Manhattan's old money society, women who attended these charitable events to maintain their social standing while contributing minimal actual time or resources to causes they claimed to support. This documentary explores the intersection of racial prejudice and political power in 1950s New York City, when black Americans who achieved economic success or social prominence faced constant attacks from white people whose racism was amplified rather than diminished by witnessing black excellence that challenged their assumptions about racial hierarchy and white supremacy. While we present these events for historical understanding, we recognize that extrajudicial violence and systematic retaliation, regardless of provocation or justification, undermined legal institutions and democratic processes that should govern civilized society. This content examines how racist insults from politically connected individuals created situations where criminal organizations provided the only meaningful accountability for behavior that police and courts either ignored or tacitly endorsed through their refusal to protect black citizens' dignity and safety. Though we acknowledge the profound moral complexities and long-term social costs of relying on illegal power structures to enforce respect and justice that legitimate institutions refused to provide, age-restricted for mature audiences studying organized crime history, racial dynamics in mid-century America, and the failures of democratic institutions to provide equal protection under law. The Charity Gala, where Charles Wagner delivered his racist insult, was the annual Metropolitan Society benefit for children's education, held every November at the Plaza Hotel and attended primarily by Manhattan's white political, business, and social elite, who used the event to network, display their wealth and status, and make tax-deductible charitable contributions that provided them positive publicity while costing them relatively little, given their enormous fortunes. Mayme and Bumpy Johnson's attendance at the gala represented their ongoing effort to establish legitimate social presence beyond Harlem's boundaries, demonstrating that criminal wealth could purchase access to spaces traditionally reserved for people whose money came from legal, if often equally exploitative sources, including real estate speculation, stock market manipulation, labor exploitation, and inherited wealth, accumulated through generations of racist exclusion that prevented black Americans from competing for economic opportunities that white families monopolized through discrimination. The invitation to attend the gala had come through Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., whose political power and social connections bridged Harlem's black community and Manhattan's white power structures, and who had suggested that Bumpy and Mayme's presence at high-profile charitable events would help normalize their status while also demonstrating to white elites that black New Yorkers possessed wealth, culture, and sophistication equal to anything the white establishment could claim. Powell understood that integration of exclusive social spaces required not just legal victories, but also physical presence of black people whose elegance and refinement made white racism appear ignorant and crude, rather than justified response to supposedly inferior race. And he had specifically identified the Johnsons as ideal representatives given Mayme's extraordinary grace and Bumpy's reputation for intelligent, strategic thinking that commanded respect even from people who opposed his criminal activities. Bumpy Johnson was not present in the grand ballroom when Charles Wagner delivered his insult, because he had stepped away approximately 15 minutes earlier to conduct business meeting in private suite upstairs with 3 Italian mob representatives regarding territorial agreements for numbers operations in sections of Harlem where Italian and black criminal organizations had been experiencing tensions over collection routes and payment schedules. The meeting was addressing complex issues of interorganizational cooperation that required Bumpy's personal attention and diplomatic skills to resolve without triggering violence that would attract police scrutiny harmful to all parties involved. And his absence from the ballroom at the crucial moment when Mayme faced racism meant that her initial response to the insult would be entirely her own rather than coordinated with Bumpy's strategic calculations about appropriate retaliation. Charles Robert Wagner III represented third generation of political dynasty that had dominated New York Democratic politics since his grandfather. Robert F. Wagner Sr. had arrived from Germany in 1885 and built career as Tammany Hall operative before winning election to New York State Senate in 1904 and then U.S. Senate in 1926, where he served until 1949, becoming one of most influential legislators in American history through his sponsorship of landmark New Deal legislation, including National Labor Relations Act that established workers' rights to organize unions and engage in collective bargaining. Charles's uncle, Robert F. Wagner Jr., had been elected mayor of New York City in 1953 and was currently in middle of second term, characterized by massive public housing construction, expanded city services, civil service reforms, and carefully calibrated relationships with Democratic Party bosses, labor unions, business interests, and emerging civil rights activists whose demands for equal treatment challenged political arrangements that had governed city for generations. The Wagner family's political power created protective bubble around Charles that had allowed him to avoid consequences for behavior that would have destroyed careers or triggered criminal prosecution for people. Without his connections to City Hall, police department, district attorney's office, and network of judges, lawyers, and fixers who ensured that Wagner family members never faced accountability for indiscretions, ranging from drunk driving to assault to financial improprieties that ordinary citizens would pay dearly for committing. Charles had crashed his car while intoxicated on 3 separate occasions without being charged, had been involved in bar fight that sent another man to hospital without facing assault charges, and had been fired from 2 different jobs for incompetence and sexual harassment without those dismissals affecting his ability to secure new positions. Through family connections that made employers eager to curry favor with mayor's office, regardless of Charles's actual qualifications or work ethic. The racist insult Charles delivered to Mayme Johnson reflected both his personal bigotry and his assumption that his family's political power would shield him from retaliation by a black woman and her criminal husband whose influence, however substantial within Harlem, could not possibly match the institutional authority controlled by Mayor of New York City and all the police officers, prosecutors, judges, and political operatives whose careers depended on maintaining good relationships with City Hall. Charles had consumed approximately 7 cocktails over the course of the evening, lowering whatever inhibitions might normally have prevented him from expressing his racism so publicly and crudely, and he was surrounded by a group of similarly privileged young white men whose laughter and encouragement, after he delivered the insult, reinforced his sense that humiliating black woman at charity gala represented acceptable entertainment rather than moral outrage, deserving immediate condemnation and social ostracism. Mayme Johnson's walk across the grand ballroom toward Charles Wagner took approximately 43 seconds, during which the shocked silence gradually gave way to nervous whispers as approximately 200 white guests processed what they had just witnessed and tried to calculate whether they should intervene to prevent confrontation, pretend they hadn't heard the insult, or simply wait to see what this elegant black woman would do when she reached the drunken young man who had publicly degraded her with language that revealed depths of racial hatred that most of these supposedly civilized people preferred to believe didn't exist. Among educated, upper-class whites who claimed to support civil rights and racial equality while simultaneously maintaining exclusive social and economic systems that perpetuated white supremacy through genteel discrimination rather than crude slurs. The confrontation when Mayme reached Charles's table was witnessed by approximately 70 people within direct visual and audio range, plus dozens more who turned to watch after word spread through the ballroom that something dramatic was unfolding. Mayme stopped 3 feet from Charles, made eye contact, and spoke in voice that carried perfect diction and controlled intensity. "You will apologize immediately, publicly, and sincerely for your racist insult. Then you will leave this event and spend considerable time reflecting on how your privilege and hatred have combined to make you precisely the kind of person whose ignorance and cruelty perpetuate injustice in this city and this nation." The directness of her demand, combined with her refusal to show fear or uncertainty despite being surrounded by hostile white people in unfamiliar territory far from the Harlem neighborhoods where she commanded respect and protection, created moment of genuine tension as everyone waited to see whether Charles would recognize that he had made terrible mistake or whether he would compound his error by refusing to acknowledge wrongdoing. Charles Wagner's response was to laugh, turn to his friends, and make additional racist joke about the help not knowing their place anymore, demonstrating that even direct confrontation from the woman he had insulted could not penetrate his conviction that his family's power made him immune to consequences and that black people, regardless of their wealth or dignity or legitimate grievances, had no right to demand respect from white men connected to most powerful political family in New York City. This second insult, delivered directly to Mayme's face after she had given him opportunity to apologize and avoid escalation, represented point of no return, after which the situation could not be resolved through dialogue or de-escalation, but would instead require the kind of systematic retaliation that Bumpy Johnson's organization specialized in deploying against people who attacked his interests or threatened his family. If you've witnessed moment when privileged persons' arrogance led them to catastrophically underestimate opponents' power and willingness to retaliate, subscribe and comment about situations where social status couldn't protect someone from consequences of their cruelty. Because what happened next would teach Charles Wagner that his uncle's position as mayor provided zero protection against Harlem's most powerful criminal operator, whose love for his wife and commitment to defending black dignity would drive response so comprehensive and devastating that Wagner family political dynasty would be permanently damaged by association with racist nephew, whose insults triggered retribution that Uncle Robert couldn't prevent and couldn't survive politically. Mayme Johnson's response to Charles's second insult was to maintain her dignified composure while delivering final statement that combined warning and prophecy. "You have made terrible mistake tonight, Mr. Wagner. The protection you believe your family provides is not nearly as comprehensive as you imagine. You will learn that lesson very soon." She then turned and walked calmly toward the exit, her departure creating ripple of conversation among guests who were beginning to realize that they had witnessed something more significant than simple drunk man's racist outburst, that they had seen powerful black woman publicly challenged by politically connected white supremacists, and that the aftermath of this confrontation would likely extend far beyond the ballroom, into complex territory where political power, criminal influence, racial justice, and personal vengeance intersected in ways that could destroy reputations and careers. Bumpy Johnson returned to the ballroom approximately 6 minutes after Mayme had left, having concluded his business meeting upstairs with agreements that stabilized Italian black criminal cooperation in disputed territories. He immediately sensed tension in the room and noticed that Mayme was absent, and when Adam Clayton Powell intercepted him near the entrance and quietly explained what had occurred during his absence, Johnson's expression shifted from relaxed satisfaction about successful negotiation to cold fury that anyone observing him would have recognized as extremely dangerous emotional state, indicating that severe retaliation was inevitable, and that whoever had provoked this anger would face consequences, calibrated to ensure that neither they nor anyone else would ever again consider attacking Johnson's family or disrespecting black dignity in ways that Johnson had power to punish. The conversation between Johnson and Powell lasted approximately 8 minutes, during which Powell provided detailed account of Charles Wagner's racist insults and Mayme's dignified response, warned Johnson that Wagner family's political power created complications for any retaliation that might be contemplated, emphasized the importance of ensuring that whatever response occurred could not be traced back to Johnson in ways that would provide Wagner with justification for using police and prosecutors to attack Johnson's organization, and suggested that perhaps the most effective punishment would be systematic destruction of Charles Wagner's reputation and career prospects through methods that appeared to result from his own income and character flaws rather than external retaliation by criminal organization. Johnson listened carefully, asked several clarifying questions about exactly what Charles had said and who had witnessed it, and then thanked Powell for the information while making clear that decisions about appropriate response would be made by Johnson and his organization, without political input or constraints from people whose legitimate positions required them to maintain plausible deniability about criminal activities they might privately endorse. Bumpy Johnson left the Plaza Hotel at 10:23 p.m. and went directly to his headquarters on 132nd Street, where his top lieutenants were summoned for an emergency meeting that began at 11:08 p.m. and continued until 3:47 a.m. the following morning. The meeting involved approximately 12 key members of Johnson's organization, including Big Mark Washington, who commanded security operations, Raymond Quitrock Carter, who handled tactical planning, Samuel Chun, who managed financial operations and intelligence gathering, and 9 other trusted associates whose various specialties in violence, investigation, political manipulation, and strategic thinking would all be necessary for the kind of comprehensive response that Johnson was planning to Charles Wagner's racist attack on Mayme. The discussion during the emergency meeting addressed several critical questions, including whether immediate violent retaliation against Charles Wagner would be strategically wise, given his uncle's position as mayor and the police resources that could be mobilized. If Wagner family demanded protection for Charles, whether systematic destruction of Charles's reputation and life prospects through methods that appeared unconnected to Johnson's organization might be more effective than direct confrontation. What evidence could be gathered about Charles Wagner's criminal activities and personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited to inflict maximum damage while maintaining Johnson's deniability, and how to ensure that whatever punishment was inflicted would be visible enough to serve as deterrent to other white people who might be contemplating racist attacks on prominent black citizens, while also being subtle enough to avoid triggering full-scale political war with mayor's office that could damage Johnson's organization and the Harlem community it both exploited and protected. The intelligence operation targeting Charles Wagner began Sunday morning, November 9th, with Samuel Chun activating network of informants, investigators, and sources positioned throughout Manhattan's business, social, and political circles to gather comprehensive information about Charles's activities, associations, financial situation, romantic relationships, legal vulnerabilities, and any other details that might reveal exploitable weaknesses or opportunities for inflicting damage. The investigation would ultimately reveal that Charles Wagner was spectacularly vulnerable to pressure and exposure, living far beyond his modest legitimate income through money borrowed from friends and family, engaging in an affair with married woman whose husband would be violently angry if he discovered the infidelity, using cocaine regularly in violation of drug laws that his uncle's administration publicly claimed to enforce rigorously, and having made numerous enemies through his arrogant behavior and casual cruelty toward people he considered inferior, including service workers, subordinates at jobs he had been fired from, and various women he had dated who described him as abusive and controlling. The systematic campaign against Charles Wagner would unfold across 3 weeks in November 1958 through series of coordinated operations designed to destroy his finances, relationships, reputation, career prospects, and sense of security, while making each blow appear to result from his own behavior rather than external retaliation. This approach reflected Johnson's understanding that most effective punishment wasn't necessarily direct violence, but rather comprehensive dismantling of target's life in ways that left them isolated, humiliated, and powerless, while also serving as public demonstration that attacking Johnson's family or insulting black dignity would trigger consequences that political connections couldn't prevent and privilege couldn't survive. The financial destruction began Monday, November 10th, when several of Charles Wagner's creditors simultaneously demanded immediate repayment of loans totaling approximately $34,000 that Charles had no capacity to repay from his legitimate income or savings. The creditors had been contacted by intermediaries who offered to purchase the debts at discount in exchange for their cooperation in timing their collection, efforts to create maximum pressure. And Charles found himself facing legal threats from multiple directions without understanding that these apparently independent financial problems were actually a coordinated campaign orchestrated by Johnson's organization. The financial pressure was compounded by anonymous tips to IRS about Charles's unreported income and possible tax evasion, triggering audit that would eventually reveal discrepancies requiring him to pay approximately $12,000 in back taxes and penalties that he couldn't afford. The exposure of Charles's affair occurred Wednesday, November 12th, when photographs of Charles and his married lover entering Manhattan Hotel were delivered to the woman's husband, along with detailed log documenting dates and locations of their meetings over previous 7 months. The husband was particularly problematic target for Charles because he was a prominent corporate attorney with violent temper and powerful connections, who could make Charles's life miserable through both legal harassment and social ostracism within business circles that Charles hoped to penetrate for career opportunities. The husband confronted his wife that evening. She confirmed the affair, and by Thursday morning Charles was receiving threatening phone calls demanding that he stay away from the woman, and warning that if he violated that instruction he would face consequences that his uncle's position couldn't prevent. The drug use exposure came Friday, November 14th, when an anonymous package containing cocaine residue, photographs of Charles using drugs at various social events, and detailed written report documenting his regular purchases from dealer in Greenwich Village was delivered to police precinct with note suggesting that Mayme's nephew was violating drug laws that Mayer publicly supported enforcing strictly. The police captain who received the package faced difficult choice between investigating Mayer's nephew for drug crimes or suppressing evidence to protect Wagner family from embarrassment, and he ultimately chose to forward the materials to Internal Affairs while also quietly warning Mayer's office that serious allegations had been made requiring some form of response, even if full prosecution might be politically unacceptable. The systematic destruction of Charles Wagner's life continued through additional operations, including anonymous letters to his employer detailing sexual harassment complaints from women who had worked with him, threatening phone calls at odd hours, disrupting his sleep and creating constant anxiety, vandalism of his car and apartment that police investigated perfunctorily without solving, and strategic leaks to gossip columnists about his mounting financial and legal problems that gradually destroyed his social reputation among people who had previously tolerated his presence at parties and events because of his family connections. Each individual attack might have been survivable in isolation, but the cumulative effect of sustained pressure from multiple directions simultaneously created overwhelming crisis that Charles lacked skills or resources to manage effectively. Major Robert F. and Wagner Jr. learned about his nephew's problems gradually through various channels, including police reports, concerned family members, and eventually direct confrontation with Charles, who came to City Hall seeking help on Tuesday, November 18th, looking disheveled and desperate after 10 days of relentless pressure. The mayor faced extremely difficult political situation because helping his nephew would require using city resources to protect someone whose racist behavior had been witnessed by dozens of people at charity gala, and whose drug use, financial impropriety, and other misconduct had now been documented through evidence that could be leaked to press if Wagner appeared to be shielding family member from legitimate consequences. The mayor was also sophisticated enough to recognize that coordinated nature of Charles's problems suggested organized retaliation rather than coincidental bad luck. And while he couldn't prove Johnson's involvement, he understood that attacking powerful black criminal operator to defend racist nephew would create political disaster, especially among black voters whose support Wagner needed for re-election campaign he was planning for 1961. Wagner's decision was to tell his nephew that he would not intervene to stop the various legal, financial, and social consequences Charles was experiencing, that Charles needed to leave New York City immediately to escape whatever additional retaliation might be planned, and that the Wagner family would provide some financial support for relocation but would not use political influence to solve problems that Charles had created through his own racist behavior and general incompetence. This abandonment by the family member Charles had believed would protect him represented perhaps the most devastating blow in the entire campaign, demonstrating that his uncle's political power was ultimately less important than his political survival, and that mayors don't sacrifice their careers to protect nephews who embarrass them with public racism and documented criminal behavior. Charles Robert Wagner III left New York on November 21, 1958, relocated to his aunt's home in Hartford, Connecticut, and never returned to the city except for brief family visits during holidays. His departure was reported in gossip columns as indefinite relocation for health reasons, but everyone involved understood that he had been driven out by a combination of financial collapse, legal problems, relationship disasters, and reputational destruction that made continuing his previous life impossible. The systematic nature of his downfall became topic of discussion in both Harlem and Manhattan social circles, with most people correctly suspecting that Bumpy Johnson had orchestrated the retaliation while also recognizing that Johnson had been brilliant enough to ensure no direct evidence connected him to any specific action against Charles. Have you seen privileged people discover that social status provides zero protection when they attack wrong target? Hit like and subscribe, because the aftermath of Charles Wagner's destruction would establish new understanding throughout New York that racist attacks on prominent black citizens would trigger consequences that political power couldn't prevent, and that Bumpy Johnson's protection of black dignity extended beyond Harlem into Manhattan's elite spaces where white supremacy had previously operated without challenge or accountability. The meeting between Bumpy Johnson and Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. occurred on December 3, 1958, in private room at restaurant owned by Italian mob associates who could be trusted to ensure privacy and security for conversation that both men wanted to conduct without witnesses or documentation. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries, including Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who understood that direct communication between Johnson and Mayme was necessary to establish clear understandings about boundaries and expectations going forward, and who also understood that both men had interests in avoiding future confrontations that would be harmful to Johnson's operations and to Mayme's political standing with black voters, whose support was increasingly important as civil rights movement gained momentum. The conversation between Johnson and Wagner lasted approximately 40 minutes and addressed several topics, including implicit acknowledgement that Johnson had orchestrated Charles Wagner's destruction, though neither man stated this directly, Mayme's explanation that he would not retaliate against Johnson for actions against his nephew because doing so would be politically unacceptable given Charles's documented racism and misconduct, Johnson's warning that future racist attacks on prominent black citizens by politically connected whites would trigger similar responses, regardless of family connections or institutional positions, and mutual agreement that maintaining peace between Mayor's office and Johnson's organization served both their interests better than escalating conflicts that would attract federal attention and damage New York's reputation as successfully managing racial integration better than southern cities, where violent resistance to civil rights was creating national scandals. Mayor Wagner's political calculation reflected his understanding that defending racist nephew against retaliation by Harlem's most powerful black figure would cost him more support among black voters than it would gain him among white voters, especially given that Charles's behavior had been so egregious and well-documented that even whites who shared his racist views recognized that publicly insulting another man's wife at charity gala crossed lines of basic civility regardless of racial Considerations. The mayor also understood that Johnson's retaliation, while illegal in various ways, had been conducted with sufficient sophistication to avoid creating situations where Wagner could credibly claim Johnson had violated laws in ways requiring mayoral response, and that the mayor's wisest course was to treat his nephew's departure from New York as family matter, having nothing to do with his official responsibilities as mayor. The broader implications of the Charles Wagner incident extended far beyond the immediate destruction of one racist white man's life to reshape calculations throughout New York about acceptable bounds of white supremacist behavior toward prominent black citizens who possessed resources to retaliate against insults and attacks. The incident demonstrated that political power and family connections that had historically protected whites from consequences of racism were becoming less reliable as black criminal organizations developed capacity to inflict severe punishment through methods that legitimate institutions either couldn't detect or couldn't address without appearing to shield racists from accountability they deserved. This shift in power dynamics didn't eliminate racism or create actual equality, but it did introduce new risks for white people whose prejudice might previously have expressed itself through casual cruelty black people they encountered in integrated spaces. The incident also revealed complex relationship between criminal power and civil rights advancement, as Johnson's retaliation against Charles Wagner served dual purpose of defending personal honor and demonstrating that black people would no longer passively accept racist humiliation, even from politically connected whites who believed their status made them untouchable. This connection between criminal enforcement of respect and broader struggles for black dignity created moral ambiguities that troubled some civil rights activists who wanted to achieve racial justice through legal and non-violent means, but who also recognized that Johnson's actions had accomplished something that courts and legislatures had failed to provide: immediate and effective accountability for racism that legal institutions either ignored or actively protected through their unwillingness to take seriously black people's complaints about white supremacist behavior. The story became part of Harlem folklore over subsequent years, retold in various versions that emphasized different aspects, including Mayme Johnson's extraordinary composure in facing down drunk racist at Manhattan Society event, Bumpy Johnson's systematic and intelligent retaliation that destroyed Charles Wagner without triggering legal response that might have damaged Johnson's organization, Mayor Wagner's political calculation that protecting racist Nephew would cost more than it gained, and broader lesson that attacking prominent black citizens would no longer be consequence-free regardless of attackers' political connections or social status. These retellings served important functions in community memory, reinforcing beliefs that Johnson protected not just his criminal interests but also black dignity more generally, and establishing precedents about expectations for respect that future generations would reference in their own struggles against racism. However, celebrating criminal retaliation as mechanism for racial justice requires acknowledging profound moral complexities and institutional failures that created situation where illegal violence became necessary tool for defending black dignity because legal institutions refused to provide protection or accountability. Johnson's organization, while defending community against racist attacks, simultaneously exploited that same community through gambling operations that extracted wealth from poor and working-class residents who could least afford losses but who participated anyway because they hoped for windfalls that rarely materialized. The protection Johnson provided came bundled with costs, including his expectation of deference to his authority, his willingness to use violence against rivals in ways that sometimes endangered innocent people, and his contribution to normalizing criminal activity as acceptable response to systemic oppression rather than fighting for reform of institutions that should have been providing equal protection under law. The institutional failures that created necessity for criminal enforcement of respect included police departments' systematic refusal to take seriously black victims' complaints about white violence or harassment, prosecutors' unwillingness to pursue charges against politically connected defendants regardless of evidence, courts' patterns of dismissing or minimizing racist conduct as somehow less serious than equivalent behavior motivated by other factors, and political systems' exclusion of black citizens from meaningful participation in decisions about law enforcement priorities and resource allocation. These structural inequalities meant that legal channels for addressing racist attacks were largely closed to black victims, leaving them dependent on extra-legal power structures that combined criminal exploitation with community defense in ways that complicated moral judgments about right and wrong, legal and illegal, oppression and resistance. The relationship between criminal power and racial justice was not unique to New York or to Bumpy Johnson's organization, but reflected broader pattern throughout American cities where black communities developed complex relationships with numbers operators, bootleggers, and other criminal figures who provided protection, resources, and enforcement of respect that legal institutions refused to offer. These criminal operators were simultaneously exploiters and defenders, predators and protectors, whose dual roles created moral ambiguities that resisted simple categorization as either purely beneficial or purely harmful to their communities. Understanding this complexity requires examining both the genuine services these criminals provided and the genuine harms they inflicted, recognizing that both aspects were real and that celebrating one while ignoring the other produces incomplete and misleading historical narratives. Mayme Johnson's role in the incident demonstrated her own power and agency separate from her husband's criminal empire, as her dignified confrontation of Charles Wagner and her refusal to show fear or subordination despite being surrounded by hostile whites in unfamiliar territory reflected personal courage and commitment to black dignity that existed independently of Bumpy's eventual retaliation. Her decision to walk across ballroom and demand apology rather than quietly leaving or appealing to Bumpy for immediate protection showed that she understood herself as autonomous individual with right to defend her own honor rather than passive object requiring male protection. And her calm warning to Charles about consequences he would face demonstrated her confidence in her husband's power, while also making clear that she herself was formidable, person whose intelligence and dignity commanded respect. The aftermath of the incident included ongoing relationship between Bumpy and Mayme Johnson that would continue until Bumpy's death in July 1968 from heart attack while eating at Harlem restaurant. Throughout those 10 years following the Charles Wagner incident, Mayme maintained the elegant social presence that had characterized her response to Wagner's insult, attending charitable events, supporting civil rights organizations, and establishing herself as a respected figure in Harlem, whose identity extended beyond being gangster's wife to encompass her own charitable works, social networks, and reputation for grace under pressure. Her 2008 memoir Harlem Godfather, The Rap on My Husband, Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, written when she was 93 years old and published 1 year before her death, provided invaluable first-hand account of life with one of Harlem's most powerful criminals and helped establish historical record that countered inaccuracies in films and television shows that portrayed Bumpy Johnson without understanding the complex realities of his life and times. Mayor Robert F. Wagner Jr. continued as New York City mayor until 1965, serving 3 terms characterized by massive expansion of public services, construction of public housing, improvements to municipal infrastructure, and increasingly difficult relationships with various constituencies, including labor unions, real estate developers, civil rights activists, and party bosses whose competing demands created political pressures that ultimately led Wagner to decide against running for 4th term. His mayoralty is generally rated favorably by historians who credit him with modernizing city government and managing racial transition with less violence than occurred in many other American cities during same period, though critics note that he often prioritized political expediency over principle, and that his reluctance to confront racism more directly contributed to ongoing inequalities that would explode into crises during subsequent decades. The systemic racism that Charles Wagner's insult exemplified continued throughout 1950s and 1960s, despite civil rights legislation, court decisions, and political reforms that nominally prohibited discrimination and guaranteed equal rights. the persistence of racist attitudes and behaviors among whites who believed themselves superior regardless of black achievements, demonstrated that legal equality was necessary but insufficient for creating genuinely fair society, and that deeper cultural transformations would be required to eliminate white supremacist assumptions that pervaded American institutions and individual consciousness. The fact that it took criminal retaliation to punish Charles Wagner for behavior that should have triggered immediate social ostracism and possibly criminal charges illustrated how far American society remained from achieving the equal justice and human dignity that civil rights movement demanded. If you've learned about complex relationships between criminal power and racial justice, hit subscribe for more stories about how Harlem's black community navigated institutional racism through a combination of legitimate activism and extra-legal enforcement. Comment whether you think communities facing systemic oppression are justified in using whatever resources they can access to defend their dignity, even when those resources come from criminal organizations whose methods and motives are morally complicated. The documentation of the Charles Wagner incident remains fragmentary because neither Johnson's organization nor Wagner family maintained records of events they preferred to keep private, and because official city records either never documented the various investigations and problems Charles experienced or were subsequently destroyed to protect Wagner family reputation. The accounts that survive come primarily from oral histories collected decades later from people who attended the Plaza Hotel gala, or who had direct knowledge of Johnson's retaliation campaign, from Mayme Johnson's memoir, which briefly references incident without naming Charles Wagner specifically, and from various newspaper gossip columns that reported Charles Wagner's departure from New York in vague terms, suggesting personal problems without explaining their nature or causes. The legal implications of Johnson's retaliation against Charles Wagner included various potential criminal charges, including extortion, blackmail, conspiracy, and possibly assault if any of the threatening phone calls or vandalism incidents could be traced to Johnson's organization. However, the sophisticated structure of the retaliation campaign, with its multiple layers of intermediaries and apparent coincidences, made proving Johnson's involvement extremely difficult, and the political sensitivity of prosecuting black criminal for attacking mayor's nephew, who had publicly insulted his wife with racist slurs, made such prosecution unlikely regardless of available evidence. The district attorney's office reportedly discussed whether to investigate Johnson's possible involvement, but ultimately decided that pursuing the matter would create more political problems than it would solve, especially given widespread belief that Charles Wagner had deserved whatever punishment he received. The incident's impact on race relations in New York City was subtle but significant, as word spread through both white and black communities about what had happened when mayor's nephew insulted Bumpy Johnson's wife and about the systematic destruction that followed. White people who might have been inclined to express their racism through insults or harassment of prominent black citizens recognized that such behavior now carried risks that political connections might not protect them from, while black people gained confidence that at least some forms of racist attack would trigger meaningful retaliation, even if legal institutions continued to ignore or minimize such conduct. This shift didn't eliminate racism or create equality, but it did introduce new calculations into white supremacists, thinking about costs and benefits of expressing their prejudice openly. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and various political figures, including Mayor Wagner, Congressman Powell, and others involved in New York's Democratic Party machinery, reflected complex interdependencies where criminal power, legitimate political authority, and community leadership intersected in ways that defied simple categorization as either corruption or pragmatic accommodation to realities of urban politics. Johnson provided resources and services that politicians couldn't openly access through legal channels. Politicians provided protection and intelligence that helped Johnson's organization avoid prosecution while continuing operations, and both sides understood that their mutual interests in maintaining stable neighborhoods and manageable crime rates created incentives for cooperation, despite ostensible opposition between law enforcement and criminal enterprises. The moral complexity of these arrangements troubled reformers who wanted to eliminate corruption and establish clean government, where officials enforce laws uniformly without political considerations or criminal cooperation. But practical politicians understood that governing cities required working with power structures as they existed, rather than as idealists wished them to be. The question wasn't whether mayors and other officials should maintain relationships with powerful criminals, but rather how to manage those relationships in ways that served public interest while minimizing the corruption and violence that criminal influence inevitably generated. Mayor Wagner's decision not to defend his nephew against Johnson's retaliation reflected both moral recognition that Charles deserved punishment for his racism and political calculation that trying to protect him would cost more support than it gained, demonstrating how electoral considerations could sometimes align with justice even when officials' motivations were primarily. The Charles Wagner incident also illustrated how criminal organizations could serve community protection functions that legal institutions refused to provide, creating situations where people who opposed criminal activity in principle nonetheless appreciated specific actions that criminals took to defend community dignity and safety. This appreciation didn't necessarily translate into support for criminal organizations, generally, or a tolerance for their exploitative activities, but it did create moral ambiguities, where a same person might simultaneously oppose numbers operations that extracted wealth from poor communities and applaud retaliation against racists who insulted prominent community members. These contradictory attitudes reflected realistic assessment that criminals were neither purely beneficial nor purely harmful, but rather complex actors whose impacts on communities included both positive and negative elements, required nuanced evaluation rather than simplistic condemnation or celebration. The incidents placed in larger history of civil rights movement and black resistance to white supremacy deserves acknowledgement, even while recognizing that criminal retaliation represents problematic model for achieving racial justice that legitimate activists preferred to accomplish through legal and non-violent means. The fact that Johnson's illegal punishment of Charles Wagner accomplished accountability that legal institutions refused to provide demonstrated both the failures of those institutions and the dangers of relying on extralegal violence as mechanism for justice. The ideal response to racist insult would have been immediate social ostracism of Charles Wagner by every person who witnessed his behavior, followed by legal consequences if his conduct violated applicable laws, and culminating in genuine cultural transformation that eliminated racist attitudes rather than simply punishing their expression. The reality was that none of those ideal responses occurred, leaving criminal retaliation as only meaningful accountability that Charles Wagner faced. The tragedy was that American democracy's promise of equal justice under law remained unfulfilled for black citizens who faced racism in countless daily interactions without any recourse to legal protections that theoretically guaranteed their rights. The legal system that should have protected Mayme Johnson from racist harassment instead ignored such conduct as unworthy of official attention, leaving her dependent on her husband's criminal power to enforce respect that should have been guaranteed by Constitution and laws that supposedly applied equally to all citizens, regardless of race. This institutional failure meant that achieving even limited accountability for racism required black communities to rely on criminal organizations whose own activities undermined community welfare in other ways, creating impossible choices between accepting racist victimization and depending on criminals for protection. The systemic changes necessary to eliminate need for criminal enforcement of racial justice included reforming police departments to take seriously black victims' complaints, ensuring prosecutors pursued charges against white defendants with same vigor they showed pursuing black defendants, appointing judges who recognize racist conduct as serious rather than dismissible offense, and creating political systems that gave black citizens meaningful voice in decisions about law enforcement. Priorities and resource allocation. These reforms were gradually implemented through decades of civil rights activism, litigation, legislation, and political organizing, though progress remained uneven and incomplete even into 21st century. The persistence of racial disparities in criminal justice system, police violence against black citizens, and ongoing struggles over voting rights demonstrated that achieving equal protection under law required constant vigilance and continued activism rather than one-time victories that permanently solved problems. The Charles Wagner incident's ultimate significance lies in what it revealed about American society in 1950s, where racial integration of social spaces created new tensions as black people who achieved economic success or social prominence encountered white racism in contexts previously segregated, where political power structures remained predominantly white, despite black citizens' growing population and political consciousness, where criminal organizations played complex roles as both exploiters and defenders of black communities, and where institutional failures to provide equal justice created dependencies on violence that undermined democratic governance, while also punishing racist behavior that legal institutions ignored. Understanding this complexity requires avoiding both romanticization of criminals as community heroes and demonization that ignores genuine protective functions they sometimes performed, instead recognizing that Johnson's retaliation against Charles Wagner was simultaneously justified response to racist attack and problematic example of how institutional failures forced communities to rely on illegal violence to achieve justice that should have been provided through legal channels. The lesson for contemporary audiences examining this historical incident is that functioning democratic societies cannot sustain themselves when legal institutions fail to provide equal protection and equal justice to all citizens regardless of race, and that such failures create vacuums that criminals and other extralegal actors will fill in ways that may serve some justice goals while creating new problems and perpetuating cycles of violence and exploitation. The challenge remains creating institutions that actually deliver on promises of equal rights rather than forcing communities into choices between accepting victimization and relying on criminals whose protection comes bundled with costs undermine the very communities they claim to defend. The story of how Mayor Wagner's nephew discovered that political power couldn't protect him from consequences of racist insult represents both vindication of black dignity and indictment of systems that made criminal retaliation necessary mechanism for achieving accountability that should have been routine rather than exceptional.